I still remember that evening clearly, not because anything dramatic happened right away, but because of how ordinary it all felt at first. If someone had told me that a simple family gathering would leave such a lasting mark on my thoughts, I would have laughed it off. At that point, it was just another celebration in our home, another reminder of how fast time had passed. The house was full of noise earlier that night. Laughter echoed from the living room, plates clinked in the kitchen, and music played softly in the background. My son had been smiling non-stop, surrounded by friends he'd grown up with. Watching him joke and talk so confidently made me feel proud in a quiet, private way. I had spent most of the evening moving between rooms, refilling glasses, collecting empty plates, and making sure everyone felt welcome. My husband was there too, of course. He greeted guests politely, exchanged a few laughs, and then settled into his usual routine. Present but distant. We worked well as a team on the surface. From the outside, we probably looked like a stable, happy couple hosting a successful gathering. Inside, though, there was a silence between us that had been growing for years. Not anger, not resentment, just distance. The kind that forms when conversations become about schedules and responsibilities instead of feelings. As the night went on, guests slowly began to leave. One by one, jackets were collected, hugs were exchanged, and goodbyes were said at the door. My son disappeared upstairs, exhausted but happy, calling out a quick good night before his bedroom door closed. My husband checked the time, said he had an early morning, and went to bed without much conversation. That didn't surprise me. It was our normal now. I started cleaning up, enjoying the quiet that followed the noise. I wiped the counters, stacked the dishes, and turned off unnecessary lights. That was when I noticed someone was still there. My son's friend was sitting on the edge of the couch, phone in hand, looking slightly uncomfortable. I realized I hadn't seen him leave with the others. He looked up when I entered the room and explained, a little awkwardly, that his ride had been delayed. It was late, and the streets were quiet outside. I told him it was no problem and that he was welcome to wait. There was nothing unusual about that. He had been in our home countless times over the years. He was practically family, or so I had always thought. I offered him some water, maybe a warm drink since the night had turned cool. He thanked me politely the way he always did. There was a sense of familiarity there, built over years of birthday parties, school events, and casual visits. I didn't think twice about sitting across from him once I finished cleaning. The house felt too quiet otherwise. We exchanged a few simple words at first. How the party was, how my son had grown so much, how time seemed to move faster every year. The conversation felt harmless, even comforting. I was used to speaking with him in short, casual exchanges, but this time felt slightly different. Maybe it was the stillness of the house or the late hour, but the words lingered longer than usual. I noticed how attentive he was, how he listened without checking his phone every few seconds. That shouldn't have stood out to me, but it did. He asked thoughtful questions, not out of obligation but genuine curiosity. I answered without thinking too deeply about it, filling the silence with stories and reflections I hadn't shared in a long time. At some point, I became aware of a strange feeling settling in my chest. Not excitement, not fear, something quieter. Awareness. I realized how long it had been since someone had listened to me like that. Without interruption, without distraction. That realization caught me off guard. It had nothing to do with who he was and everything to do with what I had been missing. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, reminding me how late it had become. I told myself the conversation would end soon, that his ride would arrive any minute. Still, neither of us moved right away. The house felt suspended in time, as if holding its breath. In that moment, I had no idea that this quiet conversation, so simple, so unremarkable on the surface, would later replay in my mind again and again. I didn't yet understand that lines don't always get crossed with actions. Sometimes they blur quietly, disguised as kindness and familiarity. And sometimes, the most unexpected moments are the ones that stay with you the longest. The house felt different once the conversation continued. The earlier noise of the party was gone, replaced by a quiet that seemed heavier than it should have been. Even the familiar sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, felt louder now. I sat across from him, aware of the distance between us and yet oddly conscious of how easily words were flowing. What started as light conversation slowly turned more personal. He spoke about feeling uncertain about his future, about the pressure to live up to expectations that weren't always his own. His voice was calm, but there was an honesty in it that caught my attention. I listened, nodding, offering a few reassuring words. It felt natural, the way conversations used to feel when people spoke without guarding every thought. Without realizing it, I began to share more than I normally would. I talked about how strange it felt watching my son grow into his own person, how time had quietly changed everything around me. I didn't complain or accuse anyone, but the truth slipped out between my sentences. I admitted that some days felt lonelier than I expected, even in a full house. Saying it out loud made it real, and that realization unsettled me. He listened carefully, not interrupting, not trying to fix anything. That simple attention created a warmth I hadn't anticipated. I wasn't seeking comfort from him, but in that moment, it found me anyway. The boundary I had always maintained felt less defined, not because of anything he did but because of what I allowed myself to share. A part of me noticed the shift and grew uneasy. I became aware of my tone, my choice of words, the ease with which I was opening up. This wasn't a conversation I would have had during the day, with others around. The late hour seemed to give it permission, and that thought made me uncomfortable. I reminded myself who he was, and more importantly, who I was supposed to be. Still, the conversation continued. He spoke about feeling misunderstood at times, about wanting guidance but not knowing where to find it. I responded. After he finally left, the house felt different. Not quieter, just heavier. I stood by the door for a moment longer than necessary, listening to the sound of his footsteps fade into the night. Nothing improper had happened, and yet my chest felt tight, as if I had done something I couldn't undo. I locked the door, leaned my back against it briefly, and closed my eyes. That was when the weight of the conversation truly settled in. I went upstairs and slipped into bed, careful not to wake my husband. He was already asleep, facing the other side, breathing slow and steady. I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying the evening in my mind. Every sentence, every pause, every moment where I could have chosen silence instead of speaking. I wasn't searching for excuses, but my thoughts kept circling the same question. Why had that conversation affected me so deeply? Sleep didn't come easily. I turned from side to side, my mind refusing to slow down. I thought about how natural it had felt to talk, how effortlessly the words had come. That realization bothered me more than anything else. It forced me to confront something I had avoided for a long time, that I had been emotionally hungry without admitting it to myself. By morning, exhaustion clung to me. The house began to wake up, filled with familiar sounds. My husband came into the kitchen, poured his coffee, and talked about his plans for the day. I responded automatically, nodding, offering brief replies. From the outside, everything looked normal. Inside, though, I felt unsettled. Guilt lingered quietly, not loud enough to cause panic, but strong enough to demand attention. As I went about my routine, I kept asking myself the same thing. Had I crossed a line? There was no single moment I could point to and say, that was wrong. And yet, I knew something had shifted. I had shared parts of myself that should have stayed protected. I hadn't betrayed my family with actions, but I had allowed an emotional door to open when it should have remained closed. I didn't blame him. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had spoken honestly, respectfully. The responsibility was mine alone. That realization was uncomfortable but necessary. It would have been easier to dismiss the whole thing as harmless conversation, to move on without reflection. But something inside me refused to let that happen. Later that day, I found myself alone in the house again. The silence felt familiar now, but no longer peaceful. I sat down and let myself think clearly without distraction. I admitted the truth I had been avoiding. The conversation had filled a gap I had ignored in my own life. It wasn't about the person. It was about feeling heard, valued, and present in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. That understanding brought both clarity and sadness. Clarity because I finally saw the real issue. Sadness because I realized how long I had allowed distance to grow in my marriage without addressing it. I hadn't spoken up. I hadn't asked for more. Instead, I had quietly accepted less, convincing myself that this was just how things were supposed to be. I knew I was standing at a crossroads. One path led to denial, pretending the discomfort would fade on its own. The other required honesty, starting with myself. I chose the harder one. I promised myself that I would not let a moment of emotional weakness turn into a pattern. Boundaries didn't just exist between people. They existed within us too. That night I made a decision. I wouldn't seek out that kind of connection where it didn't belong. I wouldn't allow late conversations or unnecessary familiarity to continue. More importantly, I wouldn't ignore my own emotional needs anymore. Avoiding the problem had brought me to this point. Facing it was the only way forward. Nothing dramatic changed overnight. There were no confrontations, no confessions. Just a quiet shift in awareness. Sometimes, the most significant consequences aren't visible to anyone else. They happen internally, reshaping how you see yourself. And once that happens, you can't pretend you're the same person you were before. And the days that followed, I became more careful with myself. Not in a fearful way, but with intention. I paid attention to my thoughts, to the small choices that often go unnoticed. I made sure there were no reasons for late conversations or private moments that could invite confusion. It wasn't about avoiding someone else. It was about protecting my own boundaries. I also began to look honestly at my marriage, without assigning blame. I realized how easy it had been to settle into routine and call it stability. We functioned well, handled responsibilities, shared a home, but somewhere along the way, emotional connection had taken a back seat. Recognizing that truth was uncomfortable, but it was also necessary. Ignoring it had nearly led me somewhere I didn't want to go. Instead of withdrawing further, I chose to engage differently. I initiated small conversations with my husband, not dramatic or emotional, just real. I asked questions and listened to his answers. At first, it felt awkward, like reaching for something that had been out of reach for a long time. But consistency mattered more than perfection. Reconnection doesn't happen in one moment. It happens through repeated effort. I also took responsibility for my own fulfillment. I stopped expecting others to fill spaces I had neglected. I found comfort in routines that grounded me, in moments of quiet reflection that reminded me who I was outside of anyone else's expectations. The more I focused on strengthening myself, the less power that single conversation held over my thoughts. What stayed with me most wasn't guilt, but understanding. I learned that boundaries aren't just rules we follow. They're choices we make every day. Emotional closeness can feel harmless, especially when it comes from familiarity and kindness. But without awareness, it can slowly shift into something that challenges the values we claim to live by. I never spoke about that night to anyone. There was no need to. The lesson was personal, meant for me alone. It taught me that temptation doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes quietly, wrapped in comfort and understanding. Recognizing it early is what makes the difference. Looking back, I'm grateful the situation stopped where it did. Not because it was easy, but because it forced me to confront myself honestly. It reminded me that responsibility doesn't begin when something goes wrong. It begins when something almost does. If there's one thing I took away from that experience, it's this. Emotional awareness matters just as much as loyalty in action. We don't protect our relationships only by avoiding obvious mistakes. We protect them by paying attention to the subtle moments that test our intentions. Life didn't change overnight, but I did. And sometimes that's enough.